Hello, and welcome to our session on understanding advocacy as an equity strategy. I'm so happy you've decided to join us today. My name is Mike Wang, and I'm a partner at Building Impact. At Building Impact, we advise funders of all sizes from all over the country on how to leverage their philanthropy to create real systemic change. At a personal level, I've spent over 20 years working at the intersection of philanthropy and public policy. I've worked inside government, I've run both advocacy and nonprofit programs, and have spent the better part of the last decade working with funders like you on their giving strategies, including how to center equity in their approach and how to advocate for broader public policy changes. And it's because of that background, as well as my observation that over the last year, donors around the country have expanded their interest in these two topics, in equity-centered philanthropy and in advocacy, that gets me so excited about our time together today. So let me take a second and walk you through our objectives for the session. Today, we're going to focus on three things. First, we're going to look at how disparities in economic and social measures of well-being relate to disparities in political power, necessitating advocacy. Second, we're going to take a look at what influence looks like when it comes to shifting public policy. And finally, we're going to explore what funders can do to support marginalized communities in building influence. And I'm really excited to feature in this session input and insights from some truly innovative leaders in the space. Both individuals who are actually in leadership positions within legislative bodies, in this case, the Pennsylvania General Assembly, Pennsylvania is my home state, but also advocacy leaders from around the country. I interviewed each of them using a series of questions about the role of organized advocacy and its relationship to pressing social issues, and have taken portions of those interviews and included them in the presentation today. What I tried to do here is bring perspectives from folks with experience in a range of issues, including education, higher education, transportation, criminal justice reform, and much, much more. And while I think it's really interesting to look at the uniqueness of their observations, you're also going to see some commonalities, and that's where we'll focus a lot of our session today.
Hi, my name is Leah Cruzy. I'm the founder and CEO of Allies for Educational Equity, a peer-funded, peer-advised political action committee.
So I'm Jordan Harris, state representative for the 186th legislative district, which covers parts of South and Southwest Philadelphia.
My name is Anthony Hardy Williams. I'm a state senator that represents the 8th senatorial district, which is parts of Philadelphia and parts of Delaware County.
So I'm Camila Shahid Diallo. I'm a partner with the City Fund, and we partner with, our funding is city-based, so we really partner with local leaders to transform their public education systems.
Right. I'm Tom Caramanico. I'm an engineer. I've been we design highways and bridges, but my nonprofit world, I've been involved in advocacy work with Excellent Schools PA.
So I want to start by regrounding ourselves in why it is so fundamentally important to position equity at the center of our work on pressing social issues. It won't come as a surprise to any member of Exponent Philanthropy, and especially anyone choosing to attend this session, that we see wildly different outcomes on measures of social and economic well-being by race. This is true in education, but it's also true in health, well-being. It's true in terms of economic opportunity, home ownership, income, virtually every category you can think of. And the thing is, these disparate outcomes don't just happen. There's a meaningful connection between public policy and these outcomes. We know these outcomes don't occur in a vacuum, but rather there is a set of policy and political conditions and a narrative that dictate so many of them. When we take a closer look at the data, we see the same sorts of inequities show up when looking at political power that we see when talking about social outcomes. We see it in voter registration, the idea that organized groups, organized voters show up in support or opposition to policymakers. We see it when it comes to financial representation in the political process. The idea that in politics, dollars lead to influence. We even see it in how the stories that shape our voters see different issues and policymakers see those voters are told. All of this in the end winds up meaning that more often than not, the same communities on which we center our philanthropic efforts to drive better social outcomes are wildly underrepresented, literally and substantively, because of the same sorts of structural inequities in the political system. Very simply put, the outcomes we get are a product of the design of the system. Let's hear what some of our practitioners have to say.
Yeah, I think that we hear a lot these days around like intersectionality. And I think that that goes for, the work that we do every day, I do every day is in education, but we see the same disparities across all of these different systems, education, housing, criminal justice, healthcare, and most marginalized communities, the disparities exist across all of those different systems. And so Groundwater Racial Equity Institute has a really good report. It's called the Groundwater Approach, and it's really looking at how these systems drive a lot of the inequalities that we see across sectors. And I think that there was some data points that show that African Americans, as one marginalized community, have worse outcomes of 1.5 to 7 across all of systems: education, healthcare, criminal justice. And the inequality is often driven by the systems. And so when we look at the political power often dictates people's ability to change outcomes of policy. So we see I see a real strong connection between political power, the ability to change systems, and doing that across all of the different systems that we're facing.
So, broadly, those that are most acutely impacted too often seem to have the least political influence, which is what makes effective policy making so challenging. Because those who make and influence public policy are not generally those who are impacted by the outcomes of whatever that decision is.
I look at places where education is lax in healthcare, and I look at it and I say that many of those places have also lacked organized political power for some time. Because when you have that organized political power, your issues, your agenda is front and center.
So it's never changed. Those who unfortunately have the least, and I don't mean necessarily only financially, but have the least organized voice, get represented the least in our political engagement. That means whatever the issue may be, if you don't have some kind of representation in Congress, in the state or local government, talking about whatever that issue is, that issue doesn't have relevance in budgetary times or policymaking times or lawmaking times.
So there's a pretty clear connection between disparate outcomes on important social issues and political power among marginalized communities. To understand why, we need to look at the connection between leadership and those outcomes. You see, appointed and elected policymakers shape political and policy conditions, programs, and political barriers themselves that lead to systems that don't improve. To understand how to change that, how to replace those unfavorable outcomes with more favorable outcomes, including policies and programs that support improving systems, we need to understand what influences those leaders and institutions. And this is where some pretty common misperceptions come in. Many folks I speak with believe that at the end of the day, data on what works, program effectiveness, and good ideas can sway leaders and institutions to change some of the conditions that are harming marginalized communities. Well, I've got a headline for you. That is simply not the case.
The world is full of great ideas. For an idea to catch fire, it has to matter to enough people, and it has to matter enough in that moment in time.
No, I mean, good results. You talk to policymakers, say, hey, that's really wonderful. You got good results. Doesn't mean a thing. They're not going to change their policy because you happen to get good results with a certain thing. They're just not.
As you know, I'm a lawyer by training, and so I practiced law before moving to education philanthropy. And I think I was really driven by this idea. If you have the right information, if people just know what the data says, that will be the driver. And I think that I was learned really early that it's not the data, it's oftentimes that we're shifting power. And so anytime that there's a power shift, it's going to require demand, because power doesn't conceive without a demand. And so I think the data is important. Like, we have to make sure that we're doing good work. But I think what really drives is information and demand.
Instead, we find that there are other levers of influence that change perspective among those leaders and institutions. In our experience, whether Republican, Democrat, urban, rural, northern, southern, whatever distinction you want to make among lawmakers, all lawmakers are influenced both in where they are on a particular issue and the extent to which that issue is a priority for them by these three stimuli: organized people, organized money, and organized message. This is how, as a community, one builds political and advocacy power.
So organized political power means understanding the strength of many as a collective instead of the power of one as an individual. Oftentimes, folks try to go at things alone. And when you go at things alone, you find yourself being lonely. When you're doing this work, you have to find ways to make your interest the common interest of others, because now it's not just you advocating for your issues, but it's a collective advocating for your issues.
So stepping back, I think of this as political power as a function of money and volume and scale. Mm-hmm. So in moving a lawmaker, in my experience, the effort to move lawmakers is a great example of how interconnected all of these issues are. We should always start with the assumption that a lawmaker's first priority is to represent the interests of their constituents well, but that they can never do that in isolation. They have to consider a bunch of other factors to determine their position on a bill. But effective organizing is not simple, not easy to achieve.
Certainly everybody has one man, one vote, and they have an elected official who represents them. But the reality is that our leadership is constituted, wherever it may be across this country, of people who are more well-positioned, with people who are organized to support them. So that may be a private supporter, a union, an advocacy group, and those groupings have a significant, frankly, if not a more significant standing when it comes to how our government works at all levels.
And so when we're looking at moving policymakers, it's how do you make sure that the policymakers have the information, but what's more important is often the demand from their constituents. Because people, power is a funny, and systems are funny things like that. Like, they just don't shift and change without that demand. And policymakers, elected officials, have to know that their constituents are going to hold them accountable to making change.
So now let's dig a little bit deeper into each of these. First, let's start with organized people. The idea of reliably mobilizing people and groups in sufficient numbers to action.
At all levels. So somebody knocking on your door on a daily basis and saying, hey, look, we represent 10,000 people, 20,000 people, here's our issue, has a consequence to how that legislator, whether they're Democrat, Republican, Independent, thinks about the issue, if they think about it at all. And those communities that frankly don't necessarily do well economically, are not well positioned economically or modestly, tend to have the least organized representation in the halls of government at all levels.
Elected officials are numbers people, and those numbers are votes. And a lot of times what you see is people respond to the numbers. So you can come and say that this is important. Nobody listen to you. Or you can bring 25 people that live in my district and as a chorus say that this is important.
Next, let's think about organized money, the ability to channel resources in a consistent and meaningful way. Look, I often wish we lived in a country where money mattered less, but it is still the lifeblood of our politics in many respects.
Control. The thing that makes policymakers change, I think, the thing that gets them to change is money and honest relationships with people who are in the field doing the work.
When there's skin in the game, people behave differently. So that's why the volume of money matters, because it can deploy resources that can be used and are needed. We live in a world of scarce resources, and money is the most scarce of resources that can create opportunities, that can create new partnerships. And what I've found in our work is if you can pool money and each party has some of their own interest in there, their own skin in the game, that creates opportunities for working together and to collaborate. And
finally, let's look at organized message. This idea that shaping media coverage can impact civic leaders' public standing, as well as their understanding of issues.
In this one, I think history is such a great teacher because when we look at even like the fight for civil rights, the push had been there for a long time. People knew the information that was there and that there were vastly different outcomes because of segregation. But it wasn't until television and seeing what this looked like that started to be able to move people. So I think that there's an emotional pull also that often dictates what's able to happen. But then
so we've heard a lot about organized people, organized money, and organized message. But how do we engage in this work effectively while keeping equity front and center? I asked our guests for some tips, and what I heard was, first, engage meaningfully with the communities most impacted.
Things that they want to see. One example that I love is the Oakland Reach, which is a parent-led advocacy organization in Oakland, where they were facing like a lot of communities, schools that were low performing being closed. And the parents decided they didn't just want the struggling schools to close, they wanted access to the higher quality schools. And so the parents developed a policy called the opportunity ticket, and they pushed the school board to change the enrollment policy to say when a school closes, we want the ability for students in those schools to have this opportunity ticket, like a golden ticket to go to the highest performing schools. But that was an enrollment policy that needed to change for the district. But they pushed that, they developed the policy, they pushed this campaign, they lobbied school board members, and were able to get that policy passed unanimously by the school board.
One, the group you're advocating for, you have to talk to them. You can't patronize them by saying we're here to save you because we have a little bit more than you do. You have to listen to them. And it's usually a nuanced and complicated conversation because, one person's viewpoint is not necessarily the other person's viewpoint, but that requires time to actually understand what is being said and then what the goal is, and then can we achieve it? The other part is, and I just got to be direct, advocacy without politics truly means there really won't be movement. They're interlocked. And I can mention to you the issue of a woman's right, reproductive rights. Democrats, Republicans, liberal, conservative, they're all engaged. all making their point, but all of them are engaged on the political battlefield as well. And those are the two things that I noticed historically around the issue that we're talking about tends to be missed on those two areas.
Next, our guests pointed out the importance of doing all three of these activities, thinking about people, money, and message together, and doing so continually over the long haul.
If you do just one of those, you may win the battle, but not the war. Like, it has to be a sustainable change. And that requires all three: the people, the message, and the dollars. And I think that part of what I've seen is when you don't have all three of those, you may get a short-term victory, but then it doesn't last because the people stop turning out. If it's just like, I think it's also the difference between mobilizing and organizing.
Yeah.
If you're going to get a whole bunch of people to show up at a school board meeting, wearing a certain color shirt, like, that's like episodic.
Yeah.
But it doesn't sustain when the next cycle happens and there's another issue.
And one of the majority leader in the Senate told us once, after it was over a year later, he said, one of the reasons that happened is you kept coming back. We didn't pass it one session. We didn't have the votes to pass it. We didn't even bring it up because we knew we didn't have the votes. And you came back and you said, we still need it. And you came back again. And we knew you were going to keep coming back. But you have to be willing to engage those people in conversation and engage them in an honest conversation. And not just once, but over and over and over again. These are long-term projects. They're not once and done kinds of things. That's one.
And these issues don't just end with one vote or one election. It's going to be continued issues. So you have to continue refining the message. You have to continue making sure that parents and families are organized, and you have to continue to fund elections if you're doing that work on the political side.
Our experts spoke at length about the importance of building diverse coalitions.
I'll give you two examples. One is a transportation related issue here in Pennsylvania. Nobody likes to raise taxes, particularly the gas tax. Nobody likes to do that. So what happens is highway construction, maintenance, and that kind of thing gets underfunded for many, many years. So we were at a point where the industry was lobbying, working on legislators to try to increase revenue over a number of gubernatorial terms, and not with any success. So the organization got together. This is a group of designers, contractors, other people got together and formed what they called a transportation funding coalition. And they worked relentlessly on talking to every legislator, having individual people who live in that guy's district who happen to be in our industry, go and talk to the person about the importance of it. Went on for a couple of years, 3 years, ultimately passed a bill that was $2.4 billion, $2.4 billion. This is in a state with a general fund budget of about $31 billion at the time. So $2.4 billion in additional revenue for transportation.
Building power is about building coalitions, and here's the thing: not doing it in a way where it's just for show, but building serious coalitions around commonality and common spaces. Do you build political power? I think you build political power by first understanding all the folks that you're working with and building a coalition with them. But you can only do that when they understand that their concerns and their issues are a part of your concerns and your issues as well.
And finally, we heard about the importance of communicating with policymakers in an authentic and ongoing way.
Won't agree on. So the question is, how do you get those people to agree? It takes money, and it takes honest relationships with people who are working in that field. If you get to know the people who are in a position to make policy, you get to talk to them, listen to what they're hearing from other people, because they're hearing from people who say, oh, I don't like that policy. Well, why don't they like that policy? And you're working in the field and you have an honest relationship with them. And once you get to know these people and they get to know you and trust you, then they'll seek your advice sometimes when there's legislation, when there's policy changes, they'll seek your advice. And that's really where you want to be.
So now we have a framework to understand the importance of thinking about advocacy through an equity lens, some tips of the craft for how to engage effectively in advocacy and keep equity at the center while doing so. But if you're not yet convinced, is this something philanthropy should take on?
If helping marginalized communities build power is the goal, then whoever is engaging in an act of philanthropy needs to step back and think, well, what is it going to take to solve that? And traditional charitable giving is one path, but there are other ways that even within the constraints of C3 and C4, that to solve that problem require a broader set of tools than just traditional charitable giving.
It's not just the policy, it is about how do you make sure that these the systems work better for the intended audience. And it is a redistribution of access and power. Philanthropy money brings power, and oftentimes the people who need that power, marginalized communities, whether it's by race, immigrant status, or wealth, don't have the power that they need. And so I think philanthropy's role is oftentimes making sure that marginalized communities have the power that they need to be able to drive policy changes.
And so I would hope that those who are of good philanthropic mindset acknowledge that this country is founded on a political environment as it is on capitalism. Yeah. Both exist, they're real. Your money means something in that. It just has to be structured in a way that has its great impact.
I don't mind. I tell people I don't support parties. I support people. And I think that's the best thing that a philanthropist or an organization can do. If the philanthropist provides the resources to an organization so that their staff can go out and make those connections, that's what you have to do.
Training, how to organize, how to build political power, how to get, in touch with your legislator, how to get, folks to pay attention. Like all of those things aren't necessarily gifts that you're born with. Lots of people had to learn and be trained on how to do those things. So I think it's extremely important that philanthropy do those things, educating people, empowering those people to make decisions on what they believe is good for themselves and good for their communities.
Philanthropy, I think, can do great work on changing conditions, but it often needs to be led and informed by the people who are the beneficiaries of those changes. And I think one of the things that that we see happening now is philanthropy giving those resources to the people who are impacted to be able to decide for themselves what needs to happen. And so I think.
Look, this work can feel overwhelming. Many of you are probably watching this session thinking, this is great, but where do I go from here? And so I wanted to reserve just a little bit of time toward the end to talk about concretely some things that you can do in your context. When it comes to achieving greater equity and transformative change, whether it's in advocacy or in your philanthropy at large, we always work with clients and funders around the country on three basic first steps. The first is revisiting your vision and theory of action. Your understanding of the problem you are trying to solve, your approach to solving it, and the ways you think that can be achieved are rooted in your life experience. Revisiting some of those assumptions to test whether you've truly contemplated the role of advocacy, whether you've thought about what it means to take an equity-centered view, is a good first step for any organization trying to proceed down this journey. Second, we suggest our colleagues look at their approach to grant making The processes that drive your grant making and your foundation forward, including things like applications, metrics, investment strategy, what you will fund, risk tolerance, and more, are critically important and ultimately must be aligned if your philanthropy is going to create transformative change and do so with equity at the center. And finally, we very simply ask, who are you listening to? What voices are showing up in your network? Who is in your portfolio? Who is on your team within your organization, your board, and more? Taking stock of where you fall in these three areas and committing to generating some next steps to study the landscape and open up yourself and your organization to real change in these areas are a critical first step.
So this is a story about Jim Bunning. Jim Bunning was a great pitcher for the Phillies. He then, when he retired from baseball, he became a senator, ultimately a senator from Kentucky. While he was senator in Kentucky, he came to Philadelphia for a fundraiser. It's because he was a Philadelphia Philly. Got a bunch of people from Philadelphia there at the fundraiser. He tells a baseball story because we know him as a baseball player. So he tells a story when he was a rookie in Detroit, 1956. He's pitching a game somewhere around the middle of the season. So he's pitching against the Yankees. First guy comes up, he's thrown a couple of balls to him. He notices every so often, just as he releases the ball, the first base coach for the Yankees whistles. So he gets the first guy out, second guy comes up, same thing. Every so often he whistles. Well, he finally realizes that the guy's picking up his grip on the ball as it comes out of his glove. And if it's a fastball, he whistles. Third guy up is Mickey Mantle. And Jim Bunning realizes that if Mickey Mantle knows he's throwing a fastball, it's probably not a good thing for him. So Jim Bunning takes a long walk around the mound. He gets close enough to the first base coach, and he says to him, if you whistle, I'm going to hit him. He goes back on the mound. He winds up. First base coach whistles. He hits Mickey Mantle right in the back with a fastball. So there's a little bit of commotion. Mickey Mantle goes to first base. The next guy up is Yogi Berra. Jim Bunning winds up to throw the first pitch. First base coach whistles. Yogi Berra drops his bat. He raises his hands up, steps out of the batter's box and says, Jim, he's whistling, but I'm not listening. And the reason that's an important story for this kind of involvement, advocacy work, is very often when we're talking to our legislators, we're whistling, but they're not listening. And the reason that they're not listening sometimes is they're afraid to get a fastball in the back, because we might be wanting them to change some policy that's really going to hurt some other group who is powerful enough to hurt them. And that's why they sometimes seems like they're not listening.
Philanthropy needs to understand that it's time to roll up their sleeves and get dirty. And it can't just be about cutting a check and patting oneself on the back and feeling good about cutting that check if we're not seeing serious systemic change.
I think the thing that just stays top of mind for me is how do we make sure that the people most impacted have the ability to design solutions that are right for them. And I think that a lot of times what we have an opportunity to do in philanthropy is to listen more, because we may be bringing some great ideas to the table, but the people who are closest to the situation often have ideas that will be more impactful and more sustainable. And so I think that there's just a humility in this work of listening to parents and families, or any community that we're trying to change conditions for, because they often have the best ideas.
To better set you up to walk away with something concrete from this session, I'd like you to do two things right now. First, I'm going to give you about 2 minutes. And what I'd like you to do is jot down on a piece of paper the extent to which right now you have thought about advocacy in your work, and you've thought about it through the prism of supporting marginalized communities to build power. How are you doing on this front? Take a second and reflect. Next, I'd like you to list at least one concrete next step for your organization in each of these categories. What is one concrete step you can take to re-examine your vision and theory of action? What is one concrete step you can take to re-examine your approach to grant making? And finally, what is one tangible way you can expand your network to ensure you're centering equity in your philanthropy moving forward? Finally, I'd like to create some accountability for you. Pick a buddy. It could be another member of your organization or a peer philanthropist, or if you've got no one else, I'm going to put my email address up on the screen. And I want you to open up an email to your accountability buddy. And I want you to cut and paste into that email your concrete next steps that you've agreed to. And I want you to include a date by which you will have committed to do these things. If you email me, I promise I'll check in with you on that date. But what I'm trying to do here is give you a little bit of a next step coming out of this session to really examine whether there's more you and your organization can be doing. Look, it's been my pleasure to be with you today. I've really enjoyed this. I'll stick around and answer some questions afterwards. And I'll just say that in our years of working with some of the most forward-thinking funders around the country, we have seen many foundations, family foundations, individuals, and institutions get on the path to centering equity in their philanthropy and to really instigating sweeping transformative change. And I think those two things go hand in hand, and I hope you'll be next. Thank you.